Today we're out here looking at the itty-bitty and, I must say, absolutely adorable Ford EcoSport. You heard that right, this is not the EcoSport, we're told. Instead, this is the EcoSport. In an interesting twist, this is in a way one of the newest subcompact crossovers in America, and also one of the oldest actually, because the EcoSport wasn't actually designed for us. Ford initially launched this vehicle back in 2003, and it was designed for South America and India primarily. And then in 2013, it received a complete redesign to give us basically what we're looking at right here. And then in 2018, they decided to bring it to America as sort of the prescription for America's addiction to crossovers. Some of you might be surprised to hear that the EcoSport is thematically replacing the Ford Fiesta in the Ford lineup, because most of Ford's sedan products are actually going the way of the dodo bird, and they've decided to refocus the entire Ford brand on crossovers and crossover-like vehicles. So the EcoSport will live on, the Ford Fiesta unfortunately will not. Although the Fiesta name appears to be disappearing in America, it will really live on in the EcoSport because under the skin, this is related. The family resemblance to the rest of the Ford lineup is also instantly obvious from the front. We get this definite Ford grille going on right here. It sort of looks like someone shrunk an Escape, stuck it in a trash compactor, if you will. We have these strong chrome bars right up front, large headlamps, fog lights below in the model that we're driving. I have to say this is probably the second most attractive entry in this segment. I think the Mazda CX-3 is the most attractive, but I really like the way the EcoSport looks. I always have. When this first launched back in 2003 and the redesign in 2013, I kept thinking to myself, why doesn't Ford just bring this to the United States? And they finally have. Now, because this was not originally designed for us in America, it is a little on the small side. It's a little bit narrower than the average entry in this segment, and although these headlamps appear to have been redesigned for the North American market, they are still pretty dim compared to some of the other entries in this segment, although the high beams actually work very well at night. The main beams are a little bit on the dim side if you live out in rural America. As with most subcompact vehicles in America, the proportions of the EcoSport can be seen as a little bit cartoonish at times, but I actually think it's cartoonish in a good way, just like with the Volvo XC40. That's why I said this is actually an adorable little crossover in my mind. The reason for the sort of distorted proportions versus a compact crossover is that the engine under the hood is a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. So dimensions up front couldn't really change that much versus a compact crossover, but they needed to make the overall vehicle a little bit shorter. And in order to do that, they needed to give us more headroom, a little bit taller of a box on top, in order to compensate for the fact that things have been squished in that sideways direction. And that results in this relatively tall profile, and then of course this very short overhang out back. At 161.3 inches long, this is almost exactly the same size as a Fiesta hatchback. It's about 1.5 inches longer. But importantly, this is nearly a foot shorter than a Ford Fiesta sedan. This is on the short side for the subcompact crossover segment, as is again obvious by its initial origins outside the United States. It's also obvious when you take a look at the side profile of the vehicle when you open the hatch, because it opens to the side, as we'll talk about in a little bit. It doesn't open up. Now you can get a spare tire on the back. It actually goes right here on the hatch, and that will make it overall a little bit longer, but it's only available in the base model, and it's an option for $185. The overall rear end design is quite similar to Ford's other crossovers, except for the hatch, as I mentioned earlier. Instead of opening to the top, it opens to the side. And it actually opens to a different side than we see in, for instance, previous generation Toyota RAV4 models. They were hinged over here on the passenger side. This is hinged over there on the driver's side. Now, this could be a practical feature or it could be an impractical feature, depending on your situation and how you want to look at it. Without a hatch on the top, taller people won't be bopping their heads if you want to interact with your cargo right like that, get up nice and close to the vehicle, because the hatch isn't there. But if you live in the city and you're buying a subcompact crossover, theoretically for its intended use as a city vehicle in America, then this is kind of a parallel parking problem, because you can see that this door opens quite wide, and it would be bopping the car behind you if you were in a tight parallel parking situation, and you wouldn't have that problem if this had a hatch. The main reason for this overall hatch design is that outside the United States, or in the US in that base model, you can get the spare tire, and that spare tire is designed to mount right here on the back of the door. But for some reason, only that base model can have the spare tire. That means that the titanium version that we're driving just has a can of Fix-A-Flat. Let's go out of our usual order and talk about cargo capacity. You'll actually find more cargo capacity back here than some of the larger overall vehicles in this segment, at just over 20 cubic feet of cargo space. That's notably more than the Fiesta hatchback or the Fiesta sedan. And it means that you can put 22-inch roller bags across the back right like that and not have a problem closing the hatch. In fact, the hatch actually has sort of a dish shape right here, so that way you could put even larger items right there and still close the door. It also means that depending on the size of your bag, you may be able to put them in this position right like that, in that more vertical position, and still close the door because of that overall hatch shape. And Ford was nice enough to give us a small roller cargo cover right there. That's a touch that I really appreciate because a lot of subcompact vehicles give us a hard cargo cover, and that's a lot more difficult to stow away when you don't need to use it. This cargo area is not as large as something like the Honda HR-V, but I actually think this cargo area is just about as practical as the HR-V because of the overall size of bags that you can put back here. And that's why I'm going to give this a 10 out of 10 point score when it comes to our exclusive trunk comfort index. Like the new Hyundai Kona, we find two engines under this hood, but unlike the Kona, the turbo is actually the base engine. It's a 1-liter, 3-cylinder turbocharged engine borrowed from the Fiesta. It produces 123 horsepower, 125 pound-feet of torque, and you'll only find that engine in the front-wheel drive versions of the EcoSport. Fuel economy should come in right around 28 miles per gallon combined. The 6-speed automatic is the only transmission available. If you want all-wheel drive, then you get this 2-liter 4-cylinder naturally aspirated engine that produces 166 horsepower and 149 pound-feet of torque. It's also mated to a standard 6-speed automatic transmission. Manual transmission is not available with this engine either. Unfortunately, with this engine, fuel economy drops noticeably down to 25 miles per gallon, which is definitely on the low end for this segment. Outside the United States, there are a variety of different powertrains available under this hood, but in the US, the EcoSport name does seem a little bit ironic when you pop the hood and take a look at those power and fuel economy figures. Although the front seats are not as adjustable as I would like, even in this top-end titanium trim, I'm actually going to give these 9 out of 10 points because I found these seats to be very comfortable. We have a manual adjustable lumbar support, which I really appreciate, and a power driver's seat. Now the seat bottom cushion does not adjust for tilt. When you lift the up button on the bottom, it actually raises and tilts the seat bottom in one motion, so you can't adjust those independently. But we do still have a tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion for a small vehicle, and overall I found the seating position to be ideal for my 6-foot frame. It's also worth noting that these front seat bottom cushions don't seem overly short, and that is something that we see in some subcompact vehicles. In order to give the impression of a roomier interior, they shrink the seat bottom cushion, and that makes it less comfortable for people that are interested in a little bit more leg support. The physical laws of the universe must be obeyed, so when we hop into the back seat, we logically find less room than a larger crossover. And that includes other entries with which the EcoSport competes, because again, this is on the smaller side of the segment. However, if you were to compare this to a subcompact hatchback or a subcompact sedan, something like a Nissan Versa or a Versa Note or Ford's own Fiesta, then we actually have a pretty good amount of room back here. In fact, I have about ½ an inch of headroom left. My hair is just barely brushing the ceiling, but my head is not touching the ceiling, and we do have the moonroof in this particular model. It's also worth noting that the roof line is fairly square, so this is not like the Honda Fit where you're bashing your head against the windowsill. You actually have to lean quite far over in order to really touch that with your head. So it means this is going to be a much more practical and usable back seat than something like that Honda Fit. However, if I try and slide over to the right side of the vehicle where this front seat was adjusted for a 6'5" passenger, you can see that there just isn't enough overall room for that. As we look around, remember that we are in the top-end titanium trim, so we do have that somewhat small moonroof right there over the driver and front passengers' heads, height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, two-way adjustable headrests, and perforated leather upholstery. There's some bolstering on the seat side, bottom, and back cushion, however it's not too extreme, so larger and smaller drivers are likely to be just about as comfortable in these seats. As we see in many small vehicles, you'll notice that the front doors are very small. That's how they fit 4 doors in a vehicle this size. So a lot of folks will end up with their elbows bashing this B-pillar right here rather than actually being on the soft touch armrest that we find on the door. That's just something that we see in a large number of subcompact crossovers. It's not unique to the EcoSport. Moving over to the doors, we find a majority of the doors made from hard plastics, again, pretty much like every entry in this segment. We do have a small bottle holder right down there at the bottom. Unlike many subcompact crossovers, the upper portion of the dashboard is actually made from a soft touch material, and that does make the surface of the dashboard feel a little bit more premium than some of the competition. We have a small storage slot right there, right on top of this moderately sized glove compartment. You could just barely fit some small items in there in this small bin, and then we have a slot right there where you could put your owner's manual. No tablet computers will fit in there, but larger smartphones may. Part of the Bang & Olufsen sound system is the center channel speaker that we can see perched right on top of this touchscreen infotainment system. This is the latest version of Ford's touchscreen software. It does fully support Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and there are a few physical buttons down here below the screen so you can have direct access to things like your sound settings right there. If you want to know more about this latest Ford infotainment system, there's a complete video on my channel about that. We have a start-stop button right over here on the dashboard, and then if you don't get keyless go, then we actually have a key slot right here on the steering column. Below the infotainment system, we have two large air vents, our controls for our single zone automatic climate control that this particular model has. Below that, we have our engine auto start-stop button, traction control disable button, two USB inputs that integrate with that system, and then a small storage area where you can put those smartphones. We also have a 12-volt power port. Continuing back from there, we have a 12-volt power port and a pretty traditional Ford console shifter. We have sport mode to the back, drive right up there. And if you're in the sport mode, you can use these gear selector buttons right over here on the side of the shifter. Between the front seats, we have a traditional handbrake and two moderately sized cup holders. I was able to fit large takeout drinks in these without having their lids pop off, but they were a little on the tight side. The center armrest is padded and it opens to reveal a two-tiered storage cubby that is very narrow. Again, remember I said the EcoSport is a fairly narrow car. We have a small divider right there that we can pull out and then have access to the larger and somewhat narrower compartment down there towards the bottom. The overall instrument cluster design is pretty basic. We have analog gauges for the speedometer and tachometer and then a color multifunction display in the middle. The steering wheel is a 4-spoke variety with sport grips up top. You'll find the controls for that multifunction display over here on the left side of the steering wheel, and then infotainment controls over here on the right. Track forward, backward that also double as phone hang up and pick up, voice command, and then volume up down. Then on the left side of the wheel, we find the buttons for the cruise control system. The acceleration in this all-wheel drive trim could be described as leisurely or perhaps glacial. 0 to 60 took over 11 seconds in the model that we're testing right here. That is notably slower than a lot of entries in this segment, even some of the slower ones like the Kia Soul with its base engine or the Mazda CX-3, which is not particularly swift. Most of the competition's CVT-equipped models will go faster 0 to 60 than the model that we're driving. That's simply because CVTs can make the most out of a small and less powerful engine. And that is definitely something that we see in this model because you really have to dig deep in the throttle in order to hill climb. Going up this particular hill, which goes from about 1,100 feet where I start to about 2,200 feet at the top, you really have to give this full throttle acceleration at times because the transmission is also a little bit reluctant to shift. Now, if you put it in sport mode, then it does become a little bit better, but then it feels like it's almost shifting too much and holding onto those gears just a little bit too long. On the flip side, if you're looking for a subcompact crossover and you really don't want a continuously variable transmission, then this is going to be a good option for you. In our 60 to 0 braking test, this model took 125 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. This vehicle does have 205 width tires on them, which are pretty typical for a subcompact vehicle. If you were to put wider tires on it, then you would get better handling and braking scores, however. And I think there's enough room for this vehicle to actually be able to support something a little bit wider if you wanted to do that aftermarket. Ground clearance is quite good in the EcoSport. We actually have just under 8 inches of clearance. And that surprised me a little bit because this doesn't really feel particularly tall. For instance, if you were to drive the Subaru Crosstrek or the Jeep Renegade, when you're chucking them into corners, they definitely lean more than this. They feel like they're a taller vehicle. But this actually doesn't feel that far off the Hyundai Kona, which I think is one of the better handling entries in this segment, especially if you get the top end trim. This compares fairly well to base versions of the Mazda CX-3, although I do think the Mazda is a little bit more fun. The relationship between the EcoSport and the Fiesta is obvious when you drive this out on the road because it does feel like a slightly larger, slightly heavier, and slightly taller Fiesta. That's actually a pretty good thing because the Fiesta is a decent amount of fun for the price. One thing to keep in mind is that the EcoSport has a fairly short wheelbase. It's under 100 inches. It's one of the shorter wheelbases in any car in the United States. And that does mean that the suspension can sometimes feel a little bit unsettled, and all four tires can feel unsettled at the same time, depending on exactly what you're running over. Short wheelbases tend to give cars a little bit of a bobble-headed feel, and we do get that to a limited extent in the EcoSport, but actually it's a little bit more muted than in some of the competition with longer wheelbases. But you do feel one of the other side effects of a short wheelbase. This vehicle does feel a little bit darty, the steering is a little bit quick, and it's a little bit easy for this to get caught in the grooves on the road. So the grooves on that pavement may cause the vehicle to squirm around a little bit, so it feels like you're fighting the car on some of those pavement surfaces. Thanks to the relatively higher aspect ratio tires that we see in the EcoSport versus the competition, the fact that the suspension is actually a little bit on the softer side compared to something like the Hyundai Kona, and the high ground clearance, which is nearly 8 inches, we actually get a very nice ride in this vehicle, even though on-road handling is still pretty good. I really like the way this suspension has been tuned for this segment. This actually reminds me a little bit of the Buick Encore. The Buick Encore is actually one of my favorite subcompact crossovers, although it doesn't really compete with the EcoSport because it is notably more expensive. It's trying to be a near luxury branded vehicle, so it's about $10,000 more than most of the trims of the EcoSport. In our cabin noise test, this model came in at 74 decibels, which is pretty average for a subcompact vehicle of any description in America. You will find some slightly quieter rides in some of the competition, but you'll also find some that are a little bit louder. As I intimated at the beginning, these engines fall down a little bit when it comes to the sport side of this vehicle's name. 11 seconds 0 to 60 is pretty slow, and this is again over 11 seconds. But on the eco side, it actually falls apart a little bit as well. Although not as bad as the EPA estimates would indicate, because we've actually been averaging 26.9 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving in this vehicle, and the EPA estimate is actually 25. So when it comes to our overall EPA score, I'm going to give this one a B-. I wish the numbers were higher, but in real-world driving, they do appear to be better than they look on paper as far as the EPA scores go. Now, you will find slightly better fuel economy in the Honda HR-V, but that's going to have a CVT. You will find better fuel economy in the CHR, but that's going to have a CVT, and it's not going to have all-wheel drive. It's just not available in that vehicle. Sometimes a vehicle can be a little bit more than the sum of its parts, and surprisingly enough, the EcoSport is one of those vehicles for me out on the road, because acceleration is honestly really disappointing, and the fuel economy could be seen as disappointing, but it's fun to drive out on the road. It's easy to tell exactly where the car is going. The steering ratio is just about right. The overall seating position is good. It's just a fun little car to drive. And that actually surprised me a little bit when I really started taking a look at some of the objective scores for this vehicle, because objectively this seems like this would be one of the less fun vehicles to drive in this particular segment, but for me at least it's not. The starting price for the 2018 EcoSport is $19,995. That gets you that 1-liter, 3-cylinder turbocharged engine and front-wheel drive. The base model is relatively well equipped, however. We do get alloy wheels, we get air conditioning, and a 6-speaker audio system. We also get the basic Ford Sync system in that S trim. When comparing base model to base model, it is important to remember that many of the EcoSport's competitors come standard with manual transmissions. For instance, the 2018 Honda HR-V comes standard with the manual. The 2019 is a little bit more expensive than the 2018 model because it's going to come with an automatic standard. So it is important to keep that in mind if you're trying to compare base model to base model. The version that you've been seeing in this video is the top-end titanium trim, which starts at $27,330 with all-wheel drive, and that gets you everything that you've been seeing in this video. One thing that you'll notice that you don't see on the chart in front of you is forward collision mitigation, forward collision autonomous braking, lane departure warning, adaptive cruise control, etc. Those features are actually not available on any trim of the EcoSport, even though you will find them standard or available on mid-level trims of most of the competition at this point. Now let's move on to our first sort of competitor, the Subaru Crosstrek. I get asked about the Crosstrek a great deal whenever we review subcompact crossovers. I'm not sure what the Crosstrek really is, but I'm fairly sure it's not the same thing as a Trax or an EcoSport or a Jeep Renegade or any of these other subcompact vehicles. Remember that the Crosstrek may be inexpensive, but it's actually about the same size as the average compact crossover in America. It's a whopping 14 inches longer than the EcoSport. That's because it is essentially a lifted hatchback version of the Subaru Impreza, and the Impreza is a compact vehicle, not a subcompact vehicle. A good parallel to the Crosstrek, Impreza, and Forester question can be seen on the Honda side. For instance, the Honda Civic and the Honda CR-V are related to one another, but Honda doesn't make a lifted hatchback version of the Civic, which would really be the Crosstrek. Instead, they make the Honda Fit, and then they make the Honda HR-V, which are one size smaller. On the Subaru side, they don't have anything one size smaller in America, so they simply made an inexpensive Impreza hatchback off-road vehicle. Now that said, price-wise, it is an incredible buy, and that's why it is selling so very well at this point in time. It outsells the Honda HR-V and a number of the other entries in this segment, but again, it's not really in the same segment. Next up, we have the brand new Nissan Kicks, which is definitely the value leader in this group, starting at $17,990. It is very, very inexpensive. In fact, the EcoSport, which is already one of the least expensive entries in this segment, is about 11% more expensive than the Nissan. Now, it is important to remember that the Kicks does not get all-wheel drive. That's one of the ways that Nissan was able to drop that price so low. The other thing to remember about the Kicks is that Nissan is competing in this particular segment a little bit differently than others. Nissan has a large number of crossovers. So the competitor to the EcoSport is not just the Kicks, but the Kicks and the Rogue Sport, which is a little bit larger and a little bit more expensive. The Kicks has high fuel economy, good handling, and relatively few options as a result of its overall positioning. Meanwhile, the Rogue Sport is a little bit bigger than the Kicks, it feels more premium, and it offers more features. But its price tag is a little bit different. So if you're shopping for the base or SE trim, perhaps, of the EcoSport, the appropriate Nissan competitor would be the Kicks. If you're shopping for instance, the titanium trim of the EcoSport, however, then the appropriate competitor would actually be the Rogue Sport, which goes from around $22,000 up to about $30,500. The Chevy entry in this segment is the Trax. The Trax got off to somewhat of a rocky start initially, but it's actually been selling very well thanks to a facelift in 2017. For 2018, it starts at $21,200, which is notably more than the EcoSport, but you actually get more inside the cabin as well. The Trax is a pretty good deal in this group. We get a 7-inch touchscreen system with standard Apple CarPlay in every trim. You also get a 1.4-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine and a 6-speed automatic in every trim, which definitely gives it better base performance than what we see in the EcoSport. Even though the Trax is more expensive than the base EcoSport, we get all that extra standard equipment, so I think it comes out to be a better value. That better value quotient continues as you work your way on up the ladder. When you compare the titanium trim that we were driving this week to the top-end premium trim of the Trax, I think that value proposition actually gets a little bit better for the Chevy. The Honda HR-V is one of the best-selling entries in this segment as well, and for 2019 it's going to get a few tweaks. It's going to start at $21,515, which again is notably above the Ford, but you will get the CVT standard for 2019, and previously it was an option. In addition to improving base content in the HR-V, they've now added a top-end trim that offers leather upholstery, which they didn't in the past. That will help it better compete with entries like the EcoSport Titanium. Honda is expecting that the EX version at $24,715 will be the volume trim, and that model will get the new Honda Sensing system, which includes radar adaptive cruise control, autonomous braking, lane keeping assistance, etc. But you won't find that particular active safety package on the base model that I think more directly competes with the EcoSport. The HR-V has had one of the nicer interiors in the segment ever since it launched, and that was a little bit surprising for Honda at the time, but they did spend a decent amount of time trying to put soft touch materials in areas where your elbows and hands would touch the doors, and it really does help improve the overall feel of the cabin. That attention to detail shows overall, because even though the interior design of the 2018 HR-V is a little bit older than the current Honda Fit, I actually think the HR-V feels a little bit more premium. But the big thing about the HR-V is how well-rounded it is. It has a big and generously sized interior, a large cargo area, a comfortable back seat, good fuel economy, relatively good handling, etc. It's not particularly swift 0 to 60, but it is faster than the EcoSport that we've been driving. The big thing to remember about the EcoSport is its low base price. That base price may not be quite as low as the Nissan Kicks, but I think that in the average purchase situation, you're going to get a better discount on the Ford than you will on the Nissan, although that could be a close tie because Nissan has been pretty aggressive with pricing as well. Here at Alex and Autos, we generally don't talk about dealer discounts because they are subject to change month to month. However, in general, we do see greater discounts at the Ford dealer than, for instance, at the Honda dealer. So the delta between, for instance, the HR-V and the Ford EcoSport could be even larger than we've talked about here. The EcoSport doesn't come across as quite as modern or quite as competitive as something like the HR-V when it comes to overall practicality, or the Mazda CX-3 when it comes to overall handling, but it is going to be very, very aggressively priced, very much like that Nissan Kicks, only the Ford offers all-wheel drive. The pricing delta between the Trax, the HR-V, and the Rogue Sport at the top end of this segment, and the EcoSport and the Kicks down there at the bottom end in terms of overall pricing at the segment is very important to keep in mind when you're doing your own cross-shopping. So I would say that the interior of the Rogue Sport is definitely more premium, it feels nicer, etc. The same goes for the HR-V and to some extent the Chevy Trax, but you're going to pay extra for that, and that really is important to keep in mind. My personal top pick in this segment, if you don't need all-wheel drive, would still be the Kia Soul. It is just very practical. The boxy nature of that vehicle makes it great to haul people, kids, a lot of stuff in the back around. If you're looking for an inexpensive option with all-wheel drive, then actually the EcoSport is a solid alternative because, as I said, your pricing at the dealer is likely going to be less than we've been discussing here. Although I think that if you can step up into the Chevy Trax, you may be a little bit happier long-term, or the Honda HR-V as well. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're looking at the EcoSport Titanium, which is what we were driving this week, then honestly, I would give the Buick dealer a look because the Buick Encore is a very good deal in this segment. Not only do we get a slightly more premium brand name, but we actually get a better warranty, a better dealer experience, and I think a nicer interior than any of the top-end trims in this segment. The Buick is an interesting alternative to really any of the top-end trims here. So whether you're looking at a top-end trim of the Honda HR-V, the Rogue Sport, or the Chevy Trax, or the EcoSport, or the Jeep Renegade really for that matter, then the Buick is going to be an excellent alternative. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Click on that button at the top of your screen if you want to support this channel. It'll take you over to patreon.com. Also find us over at facebook.com/AlexNauto so you can see what we're driving this week, and stay tuned because we will have a video on the 2019 Honda HR-V coming up very soon.